Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In today's episode, we will share some true backpacking and hiking horror stories that will remind you what happens when the wild isn't as peaceful as it seems, when the trees seem to have eyes and the silence carries more than just the wind. When the trees seem to have eyes and the silence carries more than just the wind. But before starting the video, please consider giving us a like. Also, if you have any terrifying or unnerving experiences of your own, feel free to reach out and share your story with us. Who knows, it might even be featured in one of our future episodes. Now turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself. Eric had always been drawn to the Appalachian Trail. After years of reading about its rugged beauty and soul-cleansing solitude, he finally decided to take on the challenge. He meticulously planned every detail of his trip: a lightweight tent, days' worth of supplies, and even a solar-powered battery pack for emergencies. Day one on the trail was as serene as he had imagined. The cool forest air carried the faint scent of pine, and the sound of birdsong followed him along the winding path. He passed the occasional hiker, exchanging polite nods, but for the most part it was just him and the wilderness. On the second day, things started to feel off. He couldn't put his finger on it at first. It was little things, a rustling in the bushes that stopped as soon as he turned his head, a faint whisper of movement behind him. The trail had grown more remote, and he hadn't seen another person all day. That evening, as he set up camp, the unease persisted. The wind carried strange noises, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. But every time he shone his flashlight into the darkness, there was nothing there. Eric tried to shake it off. "It's just the forest," he muttered to himself. "Animals move at night." He sat by his campfire, staring into the flames, letting their warmth soothe his nerves. But then he noticed it, a shadow, just at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was a trick of the firelight, but when he looked closer, the shadow didn't move with the flames. It stayed still, tall and motionless, just beyond the trees. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he shone it toward the figure. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but the figure was gone. Eric didn't sleep that night. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made him sit upright, his flashlight trembling in his hand. When dawn finally broke, he packed up and left the trail early, abandoning his dream hike. To this day, Eric swears something, or someone, was watching him. Rachel and Mark loved the outdoors. Over the years, they had tackled some of the most challenging trails in the country. But in 2019, they decided to push their limits by exploring a remote section of Arizona's canyons, a place so isolated that most hikers avoided it. The first day was incredible. The towering red cliffs seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, and the winding paths took them through breathtaking landscapes. The silence was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Not the faint hum of civilization, just the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. On the second night, they set up camp in a narrow section of the canyon, with steep walls on either side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows lengthened, and a deep chill settled over the landscape. Around midnight, Rachel woke up. At first, she wasn't sure what had disturbed her. Then she heard it, a faint, muffled sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It was crying, soft, mournful, and unmistakably human. She shook Mark awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He sat up, listening intently. The crying continued, distant but persistent, echoing off the canyon walls. "Maybe someone's hurt," he suggested, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Grabbing their flashlights, they ventured out into the darkness, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. The crying grew louder as they walked, leading them deeper into the canyon. But something was strange. It never seemed to get closer, always staying just out of reach. After nearly an hour of following the sound, they stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. A tattered tent lay collapsed on the ground, surrounded by scattered belongings: a rusted camping stove, a torn sleeping bag, and a journal. Matt and his friends had always loved ghost stories, especially the ones tied to real places. So when they heard about the abandoned fire lookout tower deep in the Pacific Northwest, they couldn't resist planning a trip to see it for themselves. The hike to the tower was grueling, but the reward was worth it. The tower stood tall and imposing, its wooden frame weathered but intact. They decided to camp nearby, planning to explore the structure in the morning. As night fell, they gathered around a small fire, swapping stories and laughing at their own nervousness. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every crackle of the fire seem unnaturally loud. Sometime after midnight, Matt woke up. At first, he wasn't sure why, but then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from just outside the tent. He held his breath, listening intently. The footsteps circled the campsite, crunching on the gravel and fallen leaves. Heart pounding, he peeked out of the tent and froze. A man stood there, holding a lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the trees, but the man himself was unnaturally still. He wore an old-fashioned jacket, his face obscured by the lantern's glow. Matt ducked back inside, shaking his friends awake. "There's someone out there," he whispered urgently. They peeked out together, watching as the man continued to pace around the campsite. Finally, one of them mustered the courage to call out, "Hey, do you need help?" The man stopped. Slowly, he turned to face the tent. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the campsite, and the friends sat frozen, too scared to breathe. The footsteps were gone, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. When dawn finally broke, they emerged cautiously from the tent. There was no sign of the man, but in the center of their campsite, they found an old, rusted lantern. They didn't bother eating breakfast. They packed up and left the trail as quickly as they could, abandoning their plans to explore the tower. None of them ever spoke of the incident again, but Matt still keeps the rusted lantern as a reminder of that night and of the man who left it behind.